I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
The night was supposed to be a celebration of unity. Crystal chandeliers blazed above the heads of the world's most powerful diplomats. Cameras from every major news network swept the gilded room. The British monarchy, bruised but standing after years of scandals and the grief of losing its queen, was finally stepping into the light again. Composed, regal, unshakable. And then Princess Anne walked across the marble floor, looked her sister-in-law dead in the eyes, and pointed directly at the jewel blazing on her chest. The room went silent. Not politely quiet, frozen. The kind of silence that falls over a crowd when something so shocking, so unexpected, so impossibly real occurs that the human brain simply can't process it fast enough to generate sound. No one could believe what they were witnessing. Not the ambassadors, not the palace staff, not the television crews whose cameras were still rolling, capturing every excruciating second. Because in that moment, in front of the entire assembled world, the Princess Royal was doing what no one, not even her fiercest admirers, ever expected her to do. She was calling out the Queen of England. But to understand how this extraordinary shattering moment came to pass, you need to go back 10 days. To a quiet morning in a room few people ever enter. To the moment Princess Anne opened a glass cabinet and found nothing inside it but blue velvet, shadows, and the unmistakable smell of betrayal. The discovery that changed everything. April in Buckingham Palace is not dramatic. The corridors are routine. The schedule is relentless. For Princess Anne, the only daughter of the late Queen Elizabeth II, routine has always been the backbone of duty. She does not seek cameras. She does not crave applause. She walks the same halls her mother walked, carries the same weight her mother carried, and she does it with a discipline that has made her, by most accounts, the hardest-working royal in British history. On this particular Tuesday morning, Anne had come to the Royal Exhibition Room for what was supposed to be a standard pre-event inspection. With a series of major Commonwealth diplomatic engagements approaching, the palace had placed her in charge of verifying that the iconic pieces of the royal collection were accounted for, protected, and ready to be displayed or worn on behalf of the crown. It was administrative. It was routine. It was supposed to take 20 minutes. Instead, it changed everything. The Royal Exhibition Room sits deep within the palace, behind a series of security checkpoints that most staff will never pass through in their careers. It is climate-controlled, camera-monitored, and accessible only to a small list of senior personnel with biometric clearance. The cabinets inside are reinforced glass. The velvet displays are custom-fitted, each piece sitting in a mold shaped precisely to its contours so that any tampering would be immediately obvious. Anne walked to the central cabinet. She knew exactly what should be there. She had seen it there her entire life. The Williamson diamond. If you don't know the story of this stone, you need to. Because this isn't just any gemstone. The Williamson diamond is one of the most extraordinary pink diamonds ever discovered, found in Tanzania in the 1940s, and gifted to the then Princess Elizabeth as a wedding present by Canadian geologist Dr. John Williamson. It was incorporated into a brooch by Cartier and became one of Queen Elizabeth II's most cherished and frequently worn pieces of jewelry, worn on state occasions, Commonwealth summits, royal weddings. More than jewelry, it was a living symbol. Every time the late Queen fastened it to her coat, she was making a statement about her bond with the nations that had gifted it, about the Commonwealth, about continuity. The cabinet was empty. Anne didn't scream. She didn't call security. She stood completely still, the way a woman who has spent 70 years mastering the art of composure stands still when the ground shifts beneath her feet. Her eyes moved slowly, methodically across every inch of the display. No cracks in the glass. No damage to the pressure sensors. No red lights flashing from the electronic lock panel. Nothing. Just the deep blue velvet, undisturbed and immaculate, with a void in the center where the diamond should have been sitting. In 23 words, here is what that absence meant. The person who took the Williamson diamond knew exactly how to do it without triggering a single alarm. You don't walk out of the most secure room in Buckingham Palace with a priceless royal heirloom unless you have the access codes, the biometric clearance, and the intimate knowledge of the security system's gaps. The locks don't recognize thieves. They only open for people the palace has already decided to trust. Anne's hand closed tightly around the strap of her handbag. Her knuckles went white. She walked out of the room without touching anything. She did not call Scotland Yard. She did not contact the palace press office. She did not tell a single soul. Not yet. Because she understood what would happen the moment this leaked. The headlines would be catastrophic. A royal heirloom stolen from within Buckingham Palace? The monarchy, already navigating a transition period fraught with tension, would be rocked to its foundation. She would not give the story to the world until she knew exactly who had written it. So instead, Anne went home to her study at St. James's Palace, spread the royal family's schedules across her mahogany desk, and began to think. The shadow in the West Corridor. Princess Anne is not a woman who operates on instinct alone. She operates on evidence. She observes. She catalogs. She connects patterns that most people never think to look for. And over the past week, she had been watching something that hadn't sat right with her. Something she hadn't been able to name until now. Queen Camilla had been behaving strangely. Not dramatically, not obviously. The shifts were subtle enough that anyone less observant might have missed them entirely. But Anne had been raised in the most scrutinized family on earth. She could read a room the way a sailor reads weather, not from the obvious signs, but from the small ones that most people dismiss until it's too late. Camilla had canceled her afternoon tea engagements 3 times in 1 week. This, in isolation, would mean nothing. But the reason given, poor health, didn't match what Anne had seen with her own eyes. Because on one of those same afternoons, Anne had spotted her sister-in-law in the palace, moving through the West Corridor with an energy that had nothing to do with fatigue. Camilla had been dressed unusually simply, her face partially obscured by a large silk scarf. She moved quickly. She moved quietly. She did not look up. Anne had filed this away without comment. Then there was the dinner. 3 days earlier, the royal family had gathered for a private evening meal, and something about Camilla's behavior had nagged at Anne throughout the entire meal. It took her until the next morning to identify it. Camilla had kept touching her collar, repeatedly, reflexively, not adjusting, searching. The unconscious gesture of someone reaching for a piece of jewelry that isn't there yet. The body language of anticipation, of possession not yet realized but already claimed in the mind. And now, sitting at her desk with a list of names in front of her, Anne understood exactly what that gesture had meant. She needed confirmation. She needed it quickly, and she needed it without alerting anyone who might carry word back to the Queen. That ruled out almost every channel available to her. Almost. There was one man. He had served the royal household since the days of Prince Philip. He had maintained and monitored the palace security system for so long that he knew its architecture better than the companies who had designed it. He was discreet in the way that only people who have survived multiple monarchs can be. Not because they are taught discretion, but because they have lived long enough to understand what happens to those who aren't. Anne summoned him to the central control room that evening. What he told her stopped the blood in her veins. 3 nights earlier, in the dead hours between 2 and 3 a.m., the entire camera surveillance system in the Diamond Exhibition corridor had been disabled. Not through a technical fault, not through a power surge, through a high-level override code, the kind of master command that can only be issued from the very top of the palace's administrative hierarchy. Someone with authority above standard security personnel had reached into the system's architecture and simply turned off the eyes. The camera blackout had lasted 47 minutes. The Williamson diamond had been in that room when the cameras went dark. It was gone before they came back on. Anne asked the technician one more question. She asked whether any trace might remain, any buffered data, any fragmented file that the override might have failed to fully purge from the server's temporary memory. He wasn't sure. He would try. She told him to find whatever was still there, and she told him to tell no one. "If someone has deliberately tried to bury the truth in darkness," she said, her voice so controlled it barely sounded like speech, "then I will drag it into the light myself, even if the price is a fracture within the entire monarchy." The footage that couldn't be erased. The technical basement beneath Buckingham Palace is not a place designed for human comfort. Fluorescent lights, server towers, the constant mechanical exhale of cooling fans. It is a place of function, not form. Anne stood there for hours, arms crossed over her chest, watching the recovery team work through corrupted data streams line by line. When the footage finally emerged, it came in the hazy green glow of infrared, grainy, incomplete, a fragment of 17 seconds that had survived the purge because it had been automatically cached in a secondary buffer the override code hadn't reached. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. A figure appeared at the far end of the corridor leading to the exhibition room. The image was imperfect. The infrared distorted fine detail. The resolution was degraded by the compression algorithm. But two things were undeniable. The way the figure walked, a particular angle of the shoulder, a distinctive movement of the right hip, the subtle way a long dress skirt was held an inch above the floor, and the deliberateness of the movement. This was not someone wandering the palace in the grip of insomnia. This was purposeful, directed, rapid. The figure approached the biometric panel at the exhibition room door. A hand rose to the sensor. The screen dissolved into white static. The footage ended. Anne replayed it twice. Then she turned and walked out of the basement without saying a word. She knew what she had seen, but she also knew what any defense attorney, or more to the point, what any palace official whose first instinct would be to protect the monarchy from scandal, would say. A blurry figure in a dark corridor, a hand that might be reaching for the sensor, an ambiguous silhouette that could be disputed, questioned, explained away. Camilla could claim she had merely gone to view the late Queen's collection in a private moment, a night of grief and nostalgia. Who could argue with that? To do what Anne intended to do, she needed more than a shadow on a screen. She got it that same night, in a way she hadn't anticipated. The knock on her study door came after midnight. So soft, she almost didn't hear it. When she opened the door, a young palace guard stood in the frame, and the expression on his face was something Anne had not seen in a long time. It was the face of a man who had been carrying something unbearable, and who had finally decided that the weight was heavier than the risk. He came inside. He dropped to one knee in the old formal manner. And then, in a voice shaking with the effort of courage, he told her what he had seen. He had been on patrol duty in the West Corridor on the night in question. He had seen the Queen leave the exhibition room, but that alone was not what he had come to report. What he had come to report was the moment, brief, unmistakable, burned into his memory with the permanence of a photograph, when the corridor's dim emergency lighting had caught something in Camilla's palm as she left. A flash of vivid pink, unmistakable, impossible to misidentify. The Williamson diamond, blazing against the skin of a woman who had no right to hold it. The young guard's body trembled as he spoke. He understood the weight of what he was saying. To accuse the Queen of England, to do so to her sister-in-law, who had made clear she had the power and the will to use her position, was not merely a career risk. It was an act of extraordinary personal courage. Anne recognized it as such. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that said more than any words she could have offered. She now had everything she needed: motive, footage, eyewitness testimony, a plan already in motion. The sword was in her hand. All that remained was to choose the moment to use it. The plan behind the diamond. Why would Queen Camilla want the Williamson diamond? It's a question worth sitting with, because the answer reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of power and what it does to people who have spent decades fighting for it. Camilla Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla, as the world now calls her, did not arrive at her title easily. She came to it through decades of controversy, public hostility, and the kind of sustained narrative battle that would have destroyed most people. She survived. She adapted. She built an image from scratch. And now, for the first time in her life, she wore the full weight of the crown. But wearing the crown and embodying the crown are two different things. And Camilla, with the precision of someone who has spent years studying the monarchy's symbolic language, understood exactly where the gap was. Queen Elizabeth II had been the institution, not merely its figurehead, but its living embodiment. The public's grief after her passing was not just for a monarch. It was for a presence that had felt, to millions of people across dozens of nations, like an anchor in a world that kept shifting. And the symbols she carried, the photographs, the speeches, the jewels, were not decorations. They were continuity made visible. The Williamson diamond was the most powerful of those symbols in the context of the upcoming Commonwealth Summit. Every former colony, every member nation, every diplomat gathered beneath the chandeliers of that grand hall would recognize it. They had seen it on the wrist and chest of their queen for decades. To wear it at the summit would be to say without a single spoken word, "I am the heir to that authority. I am the continuation of that bond. This crown is mine now, not merely by marriage, but by legacy." Anne saw through it with the clarity of someone who had loved the late queen, not as a symbol, but as her mother. She sat in the palace library the day before the event, surrounded by portraits of her ancestors and the paperwork of the upcoming diplomatic schedule, and she dismantled Camilla's plan piece by piece. She cross-referenced the wardrobe submissions for the grand banquet and found what she'd been looking for, a notation from the royal jeweler's office confirming that Camilla had requested modifications to the bodice of her black velvet gown. The fastening had been specifically altered to support and showcase a large brooch-style pendant. This was not improvisation. This was a production, weeks in the making, every detail considered. And it was going to happen in front of the world's cameras, in a room filled with the most powerful witnesses on earth. Anne understood that she had two choices. She could go to the king, present her evidence in private, and allow the matter to be resolved within palace walls, quietly, discreetly, and in a way that Camilla's supporters would have ample time to spin and minimize. Or she could let the plan play out. She could let Camilla walk into that room wearing a stolen diamond, in front of an audience that included every international camera crew with access to the event. She could let the exposure happen where it could not be suppressed. It was not a comfortable decision. Anne was not blind to what it would cost the monarchy. A public confrontation at a diplomatic event involving the Queen of England broadcast live to international media. The fallout would be enormous, painful, possibly lasting. But she thought of her mother. She thought of the photographs of the late queen wearing that brooch on the most meaningful occasions of her life. She thought of what it meant for that stone to be used, stolen, worn as a prop in someone else's power performance, and she made her choice. "Silence is no longer an option," she said softly to herself in the empty library. She did not sleep that night. The confrontation. Tell me, have you ever been in a room when something shifts, when the air changes and every person present feels it simultaneously, even though no one can explain why? That is what happened in the grand hall of Buckingham Palace the night Camilla walked in. The chandeliers blazed. The room held hundreds, ambassadors, heads of state, senior members of the press, a carefully orchestrated spectacle of British diplomatic grace designed to project strength, continuity, and the quiet confidence of a monarchy that had survived everything the modern world had thrown at it. Camilla entered with the poise she had spent her life perfecting, The black velvet gown was flawless. The jeweler's modifications had done exactly what they were designed to do: draw the eye immediately to her chest, to the stone burning there with its extraordinary pink fire. The Williamson diamond blazed under the chandeliers as if it had been waiting for this stage all along. Guests turned. Cameras followed. Camilla nodded and smiled, receiving the recognition she had in her mind legitimately claimed. The smile was not the careful public smile of a woman performing for cameras. It was the smile of someone who believed they had won. Princess Anne stood on the observation balcony above, watching. Her face showed nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not grief. Just the absolute, terrifying calm of a woman who has decided what she is going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. She descended the stairs, one step at a time, unhurried. The crowd parted, not because anyone knew what was about to happen, but because Anne has always carried the kind of presence that makes people instinctively clear a path. She crossed the marble floor. She reached Camilla. She did not bow. The absence of the bow was its own statement. In the language of royal protocol, where every gesture carries weight and every omission carries consequence, refusing to offer the customary acknowledgement to the Queen Consort was an act of open declaration. Several guests noticed immediately. The murmuring began. Anne did not speak. Not yet. She raised her hand and pointed directly at the diamond. Just that. Just a pointed finger. But the meaning was unmistakable. Camilla's composure flickered. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Her smile held, but the hands clutching her evening bag tightened almost imperceptibly. She performed bewilderment, an innocent tilt of the head, a faint widening of the eyes, the expression of a woman who genuinely cannot imagine why she is being scrutinized. She was a skilled performer, but so was Anne. Without a word, Anne turned to an aide and gave a single nod. The large display screens at the front of the hall, intended for the diplomatic address, for the photographs of Commonwealth cooperation that were supposed to anchor the evening's message, went dark. And then they came to life with something else entirely. Black and white security footage, a corridor, a figure in the dead of night, a camera blackout. And then the recovered fragment, grainy, infrared-lit, unmistakable, of a lone figure approaching the exhibition room door. The hall did not gasp. It simply stopped. Every conversation, every clinking glass, every rustle of formal wear, it all ceased in an instant, as the assembled world realized what it was watching. The figure on screen, the timestamp, the door. Camilla staggered back a step. It was the only involuntary movement she made, but it was enough. The color drained from her face beneath the careful layering of her makeup. What had been flushed and triumphant moments before went ashen. The denial was still there in her eyes, fierce, furious, the look of a powerful woman refusing to accept the collapse of something she had built with decades of effort. But her body had already answered the question her face was still refusing to ask. Anne was not finished. The grand doors at the side of the hall opened. The young palace guard walked in, dressed impeccably in his formal uniform, his face carrying the composed and resolute expression of a man who had decided that the truth was worth whatever it cost him. He walked to the center of the room, stood beside Princess Anne, and in a voice that was clear and steady, trembling with emotion, but not with doubt, he confirmed every detail of what he had witnessed. The Queen leaving the exhibition room, the hour, the light catching the stone. Each word landed in the silence with the weight of verdict. Camilla stood alone under the lights as the room shifted around her. The king had turned his face away. Her courtiers, the staff who had smoothed her path and amplified her image through every transition, stepped back. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a gradual, quiet withdrawal that left her standing in a circle of isolation at the center of the most public room in Britain. She looked around once, twice, her rained eyes searching for a hand reaching back toward her. She found nothing. Her own hand rose to the diamond. She unclasped it herself. There was no ceremony in the motion, no grace, just the clumsy, trembling fingers of a woman removing something that no longer belonged to her in the only way still available to her. When the stone came away from the velvet, the empty space on her chest seemed to radiate its own silence. A protocol officer stepped forward with a velvet tray. Camilla placed the diamond on it without a word. The room said nothing. No one needed to. She turned and walked toward a side door, the hem of her gown trailing behind her across the marble. No longer the sweeping entrance of a queen, but the quiet departure of someone who understood that the room she was leaving was one she would not re-enter in the same way again. The door closed behind her. No one followed. After the storm. Think about what Princess Anne could have done differently. She had options, from beginning to end. She could have gone to the king the moment she found the diamond missing. She could have escalated through official channels and let the palace machinery handle the fallout internally. She could have confronted Camilla in private and demanded the diamond's return without ever involving a single camera or a single pair of outside eyes. She chose not to. Why? Because she understood something about power that people who have never lived inside it sometimes fail to grasp. Quiet resolutions of inconvenient truths are not resolutions. They are deferrals. The person who steals a diamond and returns it in private, with no consequence and no public record, has not been stopped. They have simply been paused. And Anne was not in the business of pauses. There were no celebrations in the immediate aftermath. Anne did not take a bow, did not address the room. She waited until the media's questions began to rise, nodded once to the master of ceremonies to proceed with the diplomatic program, and then, when the evening had concluded, she accompanied a small group of trusted guards back through the palace corridors to the exhibition room. In the soft gold light of the secure vault, she placed the Williamson diamond back in its case herself. She didn't hand it to an attendant. She didn't call for a jeweler to verify the placement. She set it down on the deep blue velvet with her own hands in the precise mold that had been shaped for it, and stood back. Under the focused lighting, the pink stone blazed with the same extraordinary fire it had always had. Undimmed, undamaged. Exactly as it had been when it sat on her mother's chest at the Commonwealth summits, the state visits, the Jubilee celebrations of a 70-year reign. Anne stood at the glass for a long moment. She looked at her own reflection in the panel, a woman in her 70s, unbowed, the lines of her face carrying not the softness of age, but the carved clarity of someone who has done hard things for the right reasons her entire life. She touched the glass with her fingertips. Just that, a touch, brief and quiet. Then she turned and walked out. The room was empty. The case was sealed. The diamond sparkled in the darkness behind her, returned to the place where it belonged, tended by the only person in the palace who had cared enough to fight for it without asking what she would receive in return. What this moment means. Before you move on, stop for a moment and think about what you just witnessed in this story. This is not simply a tale about a stolen diamond. This is a story about legacy and what people are willing to do to claim it, and what other people are willing to sacrifice to defend it. Camilla's mistake was not that she took the diamond. Her deeper mistake was believing that possession of a symbol is the same thing as earning what the symbol represents. You cannot inherit devotion. You cannot steal the love a nation held for its queen and wear it to a summit on your chest. Power borrowed from theft is power built on a foundation that was always going to give way. The only question was when, and in front of whom. Princess Anne understood this. She has spent her life understanding it. She has watched her family navigate scandals, divorces, deaths, schisms, and the relentless hunger of a global media machine for every fragment of weakness. She has watched institution after institution bend under the weight of individual ambition. And through all of it, she has done the same thing, over and over. She has shown up, done the work, and held the line. And that consistency, that absolute, unbroken consistency across decades, is not nothing. It is, in many ways, everything. In a family where image is carefully constructed and reputation is strategically managed, Anne represents something rarer and harder to manufacture: authenticity. She is not performing duty, she embodies it. That distinction matters enormously when the moment of crisis arrives, because the person who has genuinely lived their values is the only person with the moral authority to defend them. When Anne stepped forward that night, nobody in that room could question her right to do so. She had earned it, year after year, in 1,000 quiet moments that never made the front page. The question the world is now asking, and the question worth asking yourself, is this: was Princess Anne right to do it publicly? Was the exposure necessary? Or was it an act that inflicted a wound on the monarchy that will take years to heal? There is no clean answer. The monarchy's image took a significant blow that night. The story ran in every major newspaper, in every major country. It forced difficult conversations about power, succession, and the tension between the old guard and the new. It embarrassed the institution at the precise moment it was trying to project stability. But here is the counter-argument. A diamond worn under false pretenses at a summit built around the legacy of the woman it was stolen from, in front of every diplomat from every Commonwealth nation. That would have been its own kind of wound. Quieter, less visible, but deeper and far more lasting. What do you think? Was Princess Anne's public confrontation an act of fierce and necessary justice? A guardian defending what could not be allowed to be taken? Or was it a move that went too far, that chose the spectacle of exposure over the discretion that the institution required? Tell us in the comments. Because this conversation is not over. The Williamson diamond is back in its case. The velvet is undisturbed. The glass is sealed. But the questions this night raised about power, loyalty, and what the British monarchy truly stands for, those are sitting in the open air, and they are not going anywhere. Like this video if you believe Anne did the right thing. Share it if this story deserves to be heard. Subscribe so you never miss the moment when royal history is made in real time. Because in this family, it always is. And click the next video on your screen right now. You won't want to miss what comes next.